Hello and welcome everybody to our Lunch with Leaders Industry Icon series hosted by the Northern California chapter of ASLA. My name is Krista Van Hove and I am your current chapter president. We're so glad to have you here today, and we have a very special guest tuning in from Boston, Michael Grove. So everybody give him a big round of applause and warm welcome. We asked today if you feel comfortable and you want to share your video screen. It helps us, since we've got a smaller group, it helps us feel a little bit more connected, and it's great to see people that maybe you haven't seen. And if you know Michael or want to say hi, write him in the chat. Or if you see any friends, feel free to reach out to them in the chat too. I know it's been hard to always feel connected, but this is a great time to kind of reach out and get to see some friendly faces. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. And I was going to read something, but recently he was inducted into the Hall of Fellows. I don't know if it's the Hall of Fellows, but he recently received his fellowship from National ASLA at the past conference. And so they did such a great job of putting together his bio information that I want to introduce him with his video.
Michael Grove, Sasaki, Watertown, Massachusetts. Michael received his nomination in works from the Boston Society of Landscape Architects. He began his career at Sasaki in 1998, where he became the youngest partner in the firm's history. He has been instrumental in expanding the firm's global presence, especially in Asia, where he positions landscape architects to provide input on policy decisions and regulatory processes. He often introduces clients and government agencies to his profession's valuable perspective. One of his most notable projects is the 798 Arts District in Beijing. It has evolved from a group of squatters using abandoned factories as studio space into one of the most influential art districts in the world. Other award-winning projects include Jiading Park, Zhangjiabang Park, Songchuang Arts and Agriculture City, and the Chengdu Panda Reserve. Presenting Michael Grove, FASLA.
Congratulations, Michael.
All right, so without further ado, Michael Grove, everybody.
Thanks, Krista. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here with you all in California today. I wish I were in California today. But alas, I've been in the same place as all of you have for the last 10 months. But it's great to connect this way and be a part of the Northern California chapter, if only for a little bit. I'm going to speak today about some of my passions, which are really about landscape architects really practicing upstream and being more influential around planning and policy decisions. So I'm going to talk about projects that I feel have been somewhat influential in starting to set the stage for responding to climate change and biodiversity loss, with other landscape architects then kind of picking up from there. So I'm going to cover a number of themes. The first one is about developing landscape-led strategies with a robust civic engagement, and talking through two projects. The first is the Wuhan Yangtze riverfront in China. You'll see most of my work is in Asia, so that'll be a consistent theme through the day here. But this is the existing Wuhan riverfront park. Not a bad park, but fairly monotonous in terms of its programmatic approach, its planting, its response to kind of waterfront conditions and the levee, what it's doing with its waterfront edge and the marshlands there. And And Wuhan's a fascinating city because it's been this settlement that's had a symbiotic relationship with the river for over 1,800 years. People have embraced the waterfront for its economics, trade, agriculture for centuries. And it's still very interesting in that people continue to use the waterfront parks even when they're flooded. Now, this is posing a number of issues, mostly public health issues, but also just a use issue of how these parks engage with their constituents. We were engaged to look at both sides of the Yangtze River, a 10-kilometer stretch on either bank, to begin to rethink how this edge condition functions and relates better to the city. So you can see a very narrow stretch here, but offering a potential for a variety of conditions and setting up future project ideas that other landscape architects could then kind of pick up on. We started really by examining this kit of parts that existed there. There are 68 existing kind of legacy remnants of the parks or the waterfront's industrial past. Those range from bridges to floating barges and ports, some existing marshland, and then the existing park and the levees and embankments. And using that as kind of our main kind of vocabulary to go through how we would approach the park. We also were very cognizant of what the city was already turning its back on, beyond just kind of building these levees, which were elevated above the street level of the city. So when you were kind of adjacent to the park, you had no context that the river was there. But there was also a series of mud flats, which weren't very visually appealing, even though they provided an incredible biological value. But it was limiting kind of the real estate development potential adjacent to the park as well. And something we wanted to open up to the rest of the city. And by doing some nuanced changes to topography, thinking about planting strategies that allowed for more biodiversity within that, we were able to kind of rethink how the park could look and function and provide recreational, visual, and ecological benefits to everyone. And this is kind of how we did that. The existing sections on the left show a typical kind of Phragmites condition that exists there. They're native in this part of China. And then by carving out some channels, playing with elevation very subtly, we could still allow parts of that park to flood, while other parts would remain dry and start to work with a terrace planting typology of different plant conditions, from kind of fully submerged to temporarily inundated. We also had the same approach to looking at infrastructure. We wanted to celebrate what was there, these wonderful remnants of piers and bridges, reuse them kind of in place, but also use them as markers to talk about seasonal flooding and climate change, so that it becomes part of an arts element as well. We did a similar approach to plazas. The woman in the green shirt is actually standing on an existing barge. There are a number of floating barges in the river today that over time have built soil. As the river's flooded, sediment has been deposited, birds have dropped seeds, and they've grown, and they're these kind of thriving little native plant communities. We wanted to preserve that and create these floating barge gardens with a plaza in between, that when the river's low, you could kind of engage with that space. And when the river's high, maybe there are it's a metal mesh plaza, so the water can kind of come through. We've created these nesting areas for birds that are kind of in that undulating plaza landscape. And there's still walkways that allow people to get out to those barges. I think one of the most rewarding things of this project, though, was the level of community engagement. This is not something that's normally done in China. Public outreach is not traditionally part of an iterative design process, but working with our clients, we were able, through a series of workshops, on-site tours, a bespoke website, various social media forums, gather about 65,000 unique public feedback. And that was really something that was special as we went through this master planning process, because all of those community voices were heard and became part of the design ideas as we worked through the development of the park. The second project I want to share with you is one that's under construction right now in Shanghai called Zhangjiabang Park. Shanghai is planning these 8 what they call green wedge parks around the city, and they're huge. They're really meant to be these destination parks that are breaking up the development as it continues to kind of move out. And you can see Zhangjiabang at 494 hectares is pretty similar in size to Golden Gate Park, where you are, and allows for kind of this big regional draw and gesture. This is Zhangjiabang a few years ago. It was this remnant landscape of fallow agricultural fields, a little bit of light industry that was going on there, beginning to kind of repopulate itself with some native vegetation. And what we did was really rethink the alignment of that canal and creating more edge conditions so it would create more biological value throughout the site, not only to improve water quality, but to create more native habitat. And we did that by first looking at the terrestrial ecology on the site. Only about 5% of the existing land was covered by existing vegetation. In the master plan, we bumped that up to nearly half of the site, and a kind of combination of meadow, forested woodland, and wetland aquatic habitat. And we're able to really use this as an opportunity to educate the public again through an online feedback process with social media to talk about how people might use the space to educate childhood, early education groups and elementary schools on what the value of that richer ecology was, and really allow them to see parts of nature that maybe they've never been exposed to in an urban area like Shanghai. And then looking at these forest ecosystems in more detail. And then also the aquatic ecology. This was something that was really critical on the site, where it was about 49 linear kilometers of concrete lined canal. And by creating a more sinuous edge and allowing for that edge condition, we were able to not only improve the hydrology and the drainage capacity of the site, but also create much more native habitat that people could enjoy. And especially would create this wetland structure for a variety of different species, but also reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus in the existing water body as it traveled through the site. And one of the more interesting things that we were able to do was working with a consultant on microclimate, was to analyze how to create prevailing winds within the site, again, through subtle topography changes and tree planting strategically to capture kind of upper level winds and circulate them through the site, and then use evapotranspiration to get rid of some of the humidity. The next kind of theme I want to talk about is how we as landscape architects really serve as stewards of biodiversity and champions of conservation. This is a project we're doing right now in Chengdu, which is the Chengdu Panda Reserve. Krista, I know you've been there, but the existing facility of the Chengdu Panda Reserve is where every panda in every zoo around the world originates. This is where all of the world-class research on panda breeding in captivity takes place. And it's a very kind of landlocked, constrained facility, very dated. It was originally built in the 1980s. They don't have a lot of space to expand some of their programming. So when we were brought in, the charge was to look not just at this one site in the center of Chengdu, which is this huge kind of urban area in central China, but to look at an expansion of the reserve to 2 additional sites. One that would be used again for pandas in captivity, so that people could come and learn about them in a quasi-native habitat, and another one for pre-release training. This kind of piggybacks on the first national park in China, which was created in 2019, Giant Panda National Park, which is about the size of the state of Massachusetts, so a huge endeavor. And one of the sites for the Chengdu Panda Reserve is immediately adjacent to that and allows for juvenile pandas to be repopulated back into the wild and trained appropriately. Now, this corresponds to a strategy that China has around kind of preserving biodiversity in that region of Chengdu. This is a map from Richard Weller's Atlas for the End of the World with the University of Pennsylvania that's looked at every ecoregion around the world and its biodiversity target and understanding how much is existing preservation through conservation strategies that are already in place or laws that are on the books. And the nice thing about the Chengdu and the area around the Panda Reserve is that they're fairly close to their protection target for the biodiversity in the region. We expanded on some of that research by thinking about the reserve not only as an opportunity for in situ conservation of the species, but also ex situ conservation, where we could conduct additional scientific research, conservation education, and look at ecotourism opportunities as well to really minimize the amount of human foot traffic that would need to go into the national park, but create opportunities for people to experience the panda in a condition that's maybe more accommodating for both humans and the panda. So these are the three sites. Panda Park in orange in the middle there was the existing one. Panda Village is halfway between the existing downtown and Chengdu's new international airport as really the kind of the ecotourism experience. And then the Panda Wilderness, which is immediately adjacent to the Giant Panda National Park. We started with a land use analysis, understanding all of the needs of the giant panda in their native habitat, access to water, northern facing slopes to stay cool, topography needs, and really through GIS analysis, we're able to kind of very carefully analyze the microclimates of each of these sites and understand where the most appropriate habitats enclosures could be located. So this is the pre-release training sites where, again, all of them integrate some sort of human experience, ecological experience, but a lot of the land is focused on the pre-release training for the juvenile panda. Other sites looked at new enclosures. The existing reserve has fairly decent outdoor habitat for the pandas that are in residence on site now. We looked at expanding that to about 4 times the size of the existing conditions, and doing so in a way that would minimize the amount of human interaction with the panda, but still allow visitors to observe and see the panda in the habitat there. So considering that the reserve gets about 8 million visitors a year, which is about the same amount of visitors that Disneyland gets, we really wanted to create a way for people to still enjoy that as a tourism experience, but not impact kind of the mental health, if you will, of the pandas in the process. So you can see how that was done with, reflective windows, looking into the habitat, elevated walkways that are removed, and creating enough natural landscape for the pandas to feel like they're moving around in something that resembles a native condition. We also created a number of new facilities here, including a tram which takes you around part of the national park, additional research facilities for breeding, and a number of education centers and theaters for school groups to learn about the panda. We also wanted to make this something that could be experiential, even if you aren't able to ever make it to Chengdu in your lifetime. So part of our ask was to create a web application as well, which we call Panda Quest, which is a game that allows school-age kids to follow a panda, play games of feeding the panda, but then also if you're on site, collecting bamboo and other food for the panda and bringing that to the panda kitchen. So really allowing people to have a more interactive experience. One of the most important things of the reserve, though, is that it's not just about the pandas. Because it's a biodiversity hotspot, and the panda really is serving as an umbrella species for so many others that benefit from the conservation of its habitat. Up to 109 different mammal species, 365 different bird species, and about 31% of China's amphibian species are protected as part of the overall strategy for the reserve. I love the pre-release training areas. To me, that's some of the most interesting. Yes, this is a person dressed in a panda costume. This is how pre-release training is done, where researchers go out and act as adult pandas and actually mirror with the juvenile pandas how to do things like forage for food or defend yourself against predators or find different enclosures in inclement weather conditions. So really interesting way of reintroducing these 2 to 3 year old pandas back into the wild, which has not been successfully done before. So we're hoping that this new facility will allow that to happen successfully in the future. Another thing I think landscape architects are uniquely positioned to do is change how we design and build cities. Now, this is nothing new. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, giant sprawling cities were being developed around the world, especially here in the US, which really began to emphasize the luxuries of wealth, but also the cruelty of poverty in really sharp juxtaposition. The design of our cities really required this paradigm shift of societal pressures and a reaction against disorder and inequality of the industrial city. People were dying back then from epidemic diseases as a result of poor sanitation. And just as the existential crisis facing cities in the 19th century, climate change, I think, is our generation's greatest opportunity to rethink our cities. Similar to some of the public failures and inequity of the late 19th century, managing some of the unwanted physical consequences of development and human impacts is our generation's failure to act. It's already disproportionately impacting the poor. As you all know, you'll note that all of these photos are of women. They're the most vulnerable to climate change, especially in the developing world. And so I think my question to all of you is, how many people have to die in the United States before we as a nation take strong action? Hopefully that changes on January 20th. But again, using Richard Weller's maps from the Atlas for the End of the World, there is this really interesting correlation that we're seeing in the post kind of COVID world of this correlation between pandemic disease and where our cities are developing. And this is not unique to the developing world. It's not a third world problem. We have a serious conflict of land use here in North America between what our biodiversity targets are and what we're protecting and where our growing cities are located as well. But let's go back to the late 19th century. So at that time, urban slums, congestion, disorder, ugliness, threat of disease was all provoking a reaction in which improvements to the sanitary conditions of cities was the first demand. Betterment of public health was resulting from engineering improvements in water supply and drainage. These were essential to further growth of these urban populations. And then during this progressive era, parks were developed to provide the visual relief and places for health and relaxation. Supporters for the parks movement really believed that the opportunity for outdoor recreation would have a civilizing effect. We all know now that the inequality that also created, but there was a tangential benefit, and that the primary outcome was the demonstration that the creation of parks could really enhance the real estate values, but that allowed the rich to get richer under the veil of providing for the common good. Now, these two, who you all know, Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted, both instrumental in shaping the 19th century city, were markedly different in their approaches to city planning, although the results of their work often bore similarities. Despite being big fans of each other's work, their only collaboration was the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. The outcome, though, had one of the most significant impacts on the physical organization of many of our contemporary cities. Then came in Ebenezer Howard, utopian ideas, utopian mustache, but really created essentially this suburban form in the Garden City that incorporated low-rise homes on winding streets and cul-de-sacs, which served to further separate commerce from residences and leading to additional isolation and inequality. Now, with more people, cities will become denser and more compact and will require new frameworks. I love comparing Barcelona and Atlanta because they're very similar in size, 5.4 million people, 5.9 million people, but a very different approach. Atlanta consumes about 25 times as much land, and that leads to about 10 times more carbon emissions than Barcelona. So clearly, to respond to this, urban design needs to change. It needs to change fast. Landscape architects are a huge part of that conversation. Now, this is a project that we're doing right now in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, which is really trying to bring a lot of those thinking kind of into how we reposition a waterfront district to be more equitable, to be more open and accessible and more resilient in this landscape as well. The current site is the existing port of Saigon. This was the original port in Vietnam, built by the French in the mid-19th century or so. This is where the first Citroën automobile was imported from France into Vietnam. This is where a lot of the staging of the US troops during the Vietnam War took place. There's some wonderful old warehouses, some colonial buildings, French colonial buildings on the site. But this is the reality of the site. Kind of many times a year, the Mekong Delta is one of the most prone to climate change impacts in the world. And this shouldn't be the case. People shouldn't have to deal with driving through floodwaters as part of their daily commute and accept that. But that's what's happening in Ho Chi Minh City today. And that's likely not going to change if current practices continue. You can see kind of typical flood and extreme flood, as well as saltwater intrusion from groundwater extraction, all being aspects that are really concerning to a low-lying delta city like Ho Chi Minh. So what can we do to create a more resilient system? First is to think about connectivity. Because this was the port, behind the port was essentially a marginalized, underserved community. These were the port workers. This is one of the poorest districts of Ho Chi Minh City. They've never had access to the river before. They have the least amount of open space in the entire city, and they have zero waterfront access to them. So by creating a framework that allows those connections to the waterfront, and then thinking about how to make that landscape resilient and productive, whether it's through kind of in-street bioswales and creating water receiving landscapes or food production on site, we are able to think about how the landscape could benefit the community immediately adjacent to it. The reality is, though, because we're really preserving a lot of those existing buildings, we do have to deal with a waterfront condition that doesn't allow us to just raise the whole site. So we have to think about, again, a kit of parts here, whether that's floodable landscapes, flood resilient structures, or elevated landscape berms and removable flood barriers whenever we can. That became a part of the strategy, as did the urban design and architectural approach. There is an existing parking requirement in Ho Chi Minh, like there are in almost every city around the world, that we think is going to be different in 10 or 20 years as autonomous vehicles become more ubiquitous. There's going to be less need for these underground parking garages. Could some of them be used and designed now to accommodate stormwater? Could there be a detention capacity beyond just the landscape, but also with some of the infrastructure that we have to build by code right now for parking, to create something that's much more water resilience for the heavy monsoonal rains that Ho Chi Minh experiences every year. But also looking at the riverfront as a series of terraces and landscapes that allow people to experience it, while still raising up some of those platforms and walkways to get it out of the flood zone, but allow people to feel like they have a direct connection to the river. Also critical to this plan was about 25% tree canopy coverage on the site. This was critical, again, for microclimate as we looked at varying tree heights to allow for trapping and redirecting some of the high level winds back down to the ground plane to create a more comfortable microclimate for humans on the site. So this is a project that we've been working on in the planning stages and permitting stages for a couple of years now, and excited to see this moving forward soon. And the final kind of chapter I want to walk us all through is how I believe that landscape architects really need to be advocates for systemic change to our relationship with agriculture. Agriculture is one of the most detrimental land uses that we're facing right now, especially with climate change and food security issues. Now, if I were with you in person, you're all enjoying your lunch, but if we were somewhere together in a conference hall, we would have taken it for granted that there would likely be food waiting for us without giving it another thought. And even in San Francisco, you have this wonderful city of 4.7 million people. All of those people need to eat. And assuming they're eating 3 meals a day, that's about 14 million meals that need to be served in the San Francisco metro area every day. Now, all of that food needs to be planted, grown, harvested, processed, packaged, transported, purchased, prepared, eaten, and disposed of. And I think that's quite a life cycle. I'm willing to bet that most people here are typically only involved in about 3 of those activities. Now, imagine being in a city like Shanghai or Delhi or Tokyo with populations upwards of 20 and even 30 million people. That means you have to feed anywhere from 69 million to 114 million meals every day. But for most humans, this has become our natural environment. I think what we don't realize is that we are just as dependent on the natural world today as our ancient ancestors were millennia ago. So how did we get here? It really started about 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, where 2 critical interventions, or inventions, I should say, agriculture and urbanism, happened in roughly the same place at the same time. From that point forward, agriculture and cities were bound together. We see that play out in both ancient and contemporary urban form. This is the city of in about 2000 BC, where density is focused at the core, farmlands beyond. It's really not that different from how we live today, with the exception being that everything is much larger and more spread apart in our 21st century world. Now, even by the 1st century AD, Rome had about 500,000 people to feed, which meant that it had to begin importing food from far away. This need to feed growing cities was, in fact, the very beginning of imperialism. The physical form of our cities was also influenced by food. These are just a few interesting street names in London that I've taken over the years, all of which provide clues to the activities in the city at the time, whether it's Cornhill, Bread Street, or Pudding Lane. Now here in Boston, we have Quincy Market, and in Seattle, there's Pike Place Market, in London, Borough Market, and where you are, Market Street, just as in countless other cities around the globe. But beyond our cities, something that a lot of people feel has made America great is our agrarian history. But our romanticized version of the American farm really couldn't be further from today's reality. Take contemporary Iowa, for example. This is thought about by many of Americans as our breadbasket, but Iowans have surprisingly very little access to local food. Although they rank 3rd in the country in agricultural production, most of the food that Iowans eat comes from an average of 1,200 miles away. All of those farms aren't growing the fresh food that Iowans need. It's growing commodity crops like corn and soybeans to feed livestock or to go into processed food. Less than 1% of Iowa's farms, and even less of its land, is growing food that goes directly to humans. Now, that food needs water to grow. Where you are, 80% of the water in California consumed goes to agriculture. In fact, one singular crop, alfalfa hay, goes directly to feed livestock, not humans, and requires more water than every household in California consumes on an annual basis. Now, when we look at the correlation between the counties that were most impacted by your epic drought and the percentage of the country's fruits and vegetables that are grown there, the nation's food supply has really reached an unacceptable level of risk, in my opinion. It's not just California, though. Florida is in an equally precarious situation. It's accounting for about a third of our fruits and vegetables consumed in the US. And whether it's drought in California, flooding in the Great Plains, or higher intensity storms and sea level rise in Florida, climate change has an immeasurable impact on our food supply, especially to crops, which are already very vulnerable to shifts in weather patterns. Now, this isn't just an American problem, though we certainly aren't leading by example. Around the world, there are about 47 million acres of rainforests that are lost every year. This destruction doesn't just release carbon, it's also reducing biodiversity and increasing the threat of diseases like COVID-19. By infringing on these ecosystems, we're reducing the natural barriers between humans and host species that's creating these ideal conditions for diseases to spread. It's important to note that these microbes aren't naturally human pathogens. They become human pathogens because we offer them that opportunity. Now, all of that is to say that food as we know it today is not sustainable. This is not the future I was promised. When I was a kid in the 1980s, Willy Wonka suggested that chewing a piece of gum would provide you the same nutrition as eating a 3-course meal. Pan Am was going to offer nutritional liquid lunches on your next trans-Pacific flight, and all of our food was going to be engineered in pill form. The Jetsons was promising us a machine where our food would magically appear at the push of a button. Unfortunately, these visions of the future have led us down the path of convenient processed foods. Starting in the 1950s and continuing through to today, many of us drive to big boxes at the edges of our cities to buy packaged foods that's produced by one of 5 multinational corporations that control 80% of the agriculture in the entire planet. I want you to think about that for a minute. Just 5 companies control 80% of the food that we eat. I think this needs to change fast. And it is. Soil-based rooftop farms like this one built by the Brooklyn Grange are starting to pop up in cities around the world. They produce hyper-local food while also reducing urban heat islands and helping buildings become more energy efficient. Universities around the world are also getting on this bandwagon, experimenting with feeding their student populations. This is Thammasat University in Thailand, which just opened a rooftop farm designed by Land Process, which has the added benefit of capturing and storing stormwater. Lettuce is a wonderful crop for this type of application. This is a greenhouse near me, operated by Little Leaf Farms, just outside of Boston, which is doing it entirely with robotics, feeding hundreds of people a day with about 3 employees and a very little land footprint. So by now, maybe you're feeling a little bit more optimistic that there are solutions to our food problems, but I think there's a little more doom and gloom to share first. It's no secret that the planet's population is growing exponentially and that most of those people live in urban areas. Growing cities mean growing appetites, and to meet those needs, it means we need to increase our global food production by about 70%. Now, again, where I work in China, the problem of growing cities is especially acute with people in agriculture competing for the same land. All of China's arable land lies in the eastern half of the country, which also corresponds to where about 93% of the population lives. This conflict's resulted in a sobering amount of agricultural land lost to development, about 123,000 square kilometers in the span of a decade. For those of you who need a visual aid, that's just about equivalent to the size of the state of Iowa. Of the farmland that remains in China, about 20% of that is contaminated. Again, for you visual folks, those polluted areas represent just about half the landmass of California. The burger you ate, 660 gallons of water went into producing it, and cattle production is responsible for 80% of the planet's deforestation. Yet we're not changing our habits. In China, imports of beef have increased 19,000% over the last decade. So maybe I've convinced you to try an Impossible Burger. Maybe you already have. I commend you. But soy production is still the second to beef in terms of environmental damage. Soy that goes directly to feeding humans is great, and it's absolutely progress in the right direction. The problem is that much of the world's soy crops is grown in places like Brazil, where it's planted on land that was once tropical rainforest. So we're not asking the harder questions of where our food, whether it's an Impossible Burger when we think we're doing good, is actually sourced from. So maybe you think, great, I'll switch my primary protein to seafood instead. Again, shrimp farming is the largest driver of mangrove deforestation in the world. Mangroves are one of the most carbon-rich ecosystems on the planet. Their destruction releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere that make farmed shrimp one of the most environmentally damaging products in the world, more so than pork or poultry. And our current diets and production practices are degrading these terrestrial and aquatic systems, depleting water sources, and driving climate change. One project that we're trying to challenge the paradigm of how we think about the integration of agriculture and urban environments is this one outside of Beijing in Songzhuan. It's a 40 square kilometer new area. Now, again, China's a bit different in that the average farm is still a mom and pop operation. A positive of this system is that there's greater agriculture diversity and hence biodiversity. But the downside of this is that it makes displacement for the sake of development a real concern. So to address this issue, a team in our office has been working to create a new development model that would embrace agriculture rather than displace the people or the agriculture in these villages. So instead of the typical model where development pushes the farms aside, you can see in these plans that the idea is for development to embrace the agriculture and make it part of the urban experience. This concept really built off the use of agriculture to support textiles and fashion, as well as alternative medicine and biotech. So looking at the economic benefit of agriculture beyond just food production. This is an image that we created to describe the character of the residential areas in the plan, which would help educate people and engage them in the production of local foods. But even though our climate is changing, the way we're farming isn't, with the exception of mechanization and the increasing loss of biodiversity as from large corporate farms. Agriculture really hasn't changed in eons, even though there's so many more of us occupying the planet. So it's clear to me that the future of farming should be urban. Sometimes we're not doing ourselves as designers any favors by suggesting utopian ideas without the science backing them first. There's a lot to be said about being provocative to get people excited, but it's a very fine line that we're walking when we do that. It's not all science fiction, though. It's happening. Vertical farms, though they're still experimental, are becoming viable enterprises. This is Aero Farms in Newark. You have plenty out there in the Bay Area. Sky Greens in Singapore is another successful model. Singapore is actually really wonderful in that they have made a target by 2030 of having 30% of all the food produced in Singapore grown in Singapore. But with most new ideas, there are skeptics. Are cities really the most appropriate places for food production? Right now, the financials might still be questionable, but if we look at the long game, where transportation costs are increasing, climate change is creating new variables, and advances in technology makes indoor growing cheaper, I think there's real promise. We're in an incredible age of disruption. Imagine when autonomous vehicles are no longer experimental. We probably won't need the amount of infrastructure that's currently dedicated to underground parking or structured parking. Again, this change is already happening in Singapore. The fresh produce grown in vertical farms there is available for nearly half the cost of organic greens imported from Japan. So the economics are beginning to make sense. This is a project that we're doing outside of Shanghai called the Sunshao Urban Agriculture District. And I do think it's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel in that Chinese cities are perfect for vertical farming. For example, in Shanghai, the average diet already consists of about 56% leafy greens, which are the ideal crops for these hydroponic systems. And in Sunshao, we're taking this district, which is one subway stop away from Shanghai Disneyland, and really turning it into a foodie mecca. It's where your food can be grown. It's where you could buy your local produce at market. It's where you could visit restaurants run by celebrity chefs that are using produce grown within a block or two from where you're eating it. And it's coming as no surprise to many in the agri-tech industry that this is really one of the most efficient ways of growing crops. It yields about 40 to 100 times more produce than a soil-based farm of the same size. Now, we need to resolve the energy demands. If we can begin to get off grid, if we can use solar, if we can reduce kind of the cost of LED technologies, there's really a way to scale this at a city and regional level to feed people. It's also not meant to just be a place for industrial production of food. It's meant to be an experiential place where people can go and learn about how food is grown in the 21st century, understand how it plays into a larger ecosystem of conserving water resources, preserving native ecologies and habitat. And what really needs to change is, and something that vertical farming does well, is getting rid of the need for pesticides and fertilizers. Again, in places like China, where it's growing, use of fertilizer is growing exponentially and really contributing to the air, water, and soil pollution that's happening throughout the country. So in vertical agriculture, we don't need pesticides, we don't need chemical fertilizers. We're doing this in an organic and safe way. And this is just another image of Sunshine to show that it's really this experience where people can learn about different crops being grown around the world. So in spite of where we find ourselves today, I'm optimistic about the future of food. I love this Chinese proverb, which is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the next best time is now. This is how I think we need to be thinking as landscape architects, really upstream, big picture ideas, influencing policy. As wonderful as all of our design work is and glossy images that result from it, without thinking big picture first, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So with that, I encourage you all to think big, work upstream, become activists, run for political office, do whatever you can to influence the role that we landscape architects play in our futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I feel like my mind has just been expanded from your presentation, from going all around the world to going back in time and even looking forward into the future. So with that, we had a couple questions come in the chat. When you did the first project that you were describing on the Wuhan River Waterfront Park, there was a question about if you were using plants grown in the region or ones that were shipped from other places or countries.
Yeah, we use 100% native plants in all of our projects in China, and that's one of our goals as a firm. And we actually get hyper local with that. We've been working very closely with nurseries to expand their native stock. And because of the size of the projects we work on, we're able to oftentimes establish our own nurseries on site. So we work with the contractor to begin to set that up early on in the process and think of the site as a productive landscape, not at the end of design and construction, but as we're beginning the process.
And then another question came in about, is there a rule of thumb for canopy cover in cities in the United States? And is that similar to what you experience in other countries as well?
There's really not a rule of thumb that I'm aware of, because it really plays into so many regional and climatic factors around kind of what the appropriate native vegetation is. That said, when we're building cities, we're creating a non-native experience. So as much as you can use tree cover to shade buildings and reduce their energy demands and somehow balance that with water demands, that's certainly beneficial. But no, I would love to see someone do a study around that. Like, what is the appropriate kind of tree cover? We often look at it from kind of an equity lens of, you know, it tends to be the underserved neighborhoods that have less tree cover because there's less access to public parks and open space. It's the wealthier neighborhoods that have street trees and pocket parks and things like that that increases tree cover, therefore is creating a more comfortable microclimate in those areas. So I think beyond just the equity lens, we need to look at it from an ecological one, an energy one, a water demand one. There's all sorts of factors that play into that.
Next question, from your experience, are the big cities in China, such as Shanghai, looking into urban growth boundaries to limit their expansion into wild areas?
They are. Shanghai is actually one of the more progressive ones that I've worked in that, you know, they update their citywide master plan every 10 years. And part of that, written into that, is urban growth boundaries that are tied to transit. So transit-oriented development, densification around transit, building out their light rail and subway lines, alongside kind of the national high-speed rail network, but more importantly, looking at protected agricultural land within city limits. And I think that's something that is many cities, especially in the West, well, I should say in the United States, they're better at it in Europe, are not doing, is thinking about productive agricultural land within the urban boundary. Certainly Portland is a good example of that, but even there, they begin to infringe on some of their own policies. I think so much of it is tied to transit, and that's why you know, Helsinki is such an interesting model, because when you kind of allow people to build density along transit lines, it's limiting the need to rely on automobiles and go out further astray into our suburbs.
Great. We have one recommendation about, let's see, if for people passionate about digging into relationships between food and cities, there's recommendation to read Hungry City by Carolyn Steele. Have you read that book?
I'm going to second this. This is one of the more influential books I've ever read. Carolyn is a dear friend. She lectured at my class that I taught this fall as well. And she's an architect from London, really all about, you know, how food has shaped urban design and cities. And it's really a wonderful read if you have the opportunity.
We'll wrap up with two more questions. So I had one about, when did your awareness of wanting to advocate for systemic change in the relationship with agriculture become a passion of yours?
I'm a bit of a foodie. And so it came from my own desire to have access to more locally grown produce, and not pay Whole Foods prices all the time, and to have this become a more ubiquitous part of how we access food in our daily lives. But it really started with the Songzhuan project that we were working on, which when we started looking at it was kind of all about an existing artist village that was there and preserving that. And we really questioned ourselves, like, why is preserving this one artist village more important to us than preserving all of these villages that make their livelihoods off of the land and agriculture? So it became a bit of a justice question for us as landscape architects and planners. Like, why are we prioritizing certain things that we value over others? And that got us into a rabbit hole of understanding displacement dynamics in China and how agriculture was so central to that, and being kind of this underrepresented group that didn't have a voice. It got us into research on what the economic benefits of agriculture were. I think people, especially government officials, don't really think about that. They're all focused on the tech sector or other kind of shiny, fancy industries. But when we dug into it, we learned just how much job creation and job dependence there is in China on agriculture, and we could sell the government officials that way as kind of an economic development strategy rather than a land preservation strategy. And then at the Sunshao project, when we started work on that, there was a group that was already, these were already single-story greenhouses on the site. And adjacent to, again, Shanghai Disneyland and one of the most influential tech parks that rivals Silicon Valley in Shanghai. And they were thinking kind of wipe the slate clean, let's do another tech park here. And we said, wait a minute, you have all these tourists coming to Disneyland. You have an incredible foodie culture in Shanghai that rivals San Francisco or New York. You can create a destination here that's also doing something, you know, for food supply in the city and continuing your current mission of agriculture on the site. Why change what you're doing? You have these greenhouses that you've invested in. Let's just put that on steroids and make them vertical farms and see what we can do there. And that led us down a rabbit hole of researching vertical growing technologies and getting us hooked up with all sorts of consultants that do that, from you know, talking to people at Arrow Farms or Agriculture Consulting or Plenty to understand kind of how it's done. And it's just become like this personal interest. And now we're in conversations with developers around the world that are interested in doing something similar. They see it as value added to the communities that they're building. So beyond just kind of a rooftop growing on top of a supermarket like a Whole Foods, or a restaurant growing their herbs on their outdoor terrace, how can they really scale this up that benefits the entire community of hundreds of or thousands of residents that they're hoping to build out? So yeah, that it just became this personal interest. I'm not exactly sure how.
All right, we're at time, but I want to squeeze in just one more question because it's from one of our Rising Star emerging professionals, and that is, what is the design process like for Sasaki? And do you have people who specialize in the research of the different sites, or does everyone help out with the research?
Yeah, Sasaki, I would say, is so non-hierarchical and iterative. We value ideas over authors. So it's all about the contribution of everyone. It doesn't matter if it was an intern or a senior partner who came up with an idea. If it's a good one, we go with it. And we're constantly testing. We don't do it in a linear fashion. We certainly have subject matter experts. We have ecologists and civil engineers. But again, everyone has a voice. No one's pigeonholed. And I started at Sasaki in 1998. My plan was to stay there for a couple of years and then go work at a smaller firm or do something different. And what I loved about Sasaki is it became an extension of academia for me. It's so research focused. We have internal grants every year for research, whether it's on kind of developing a park equity atlas or researching floating wetlands or autonomous vehicles and how urban design might be changing. We allow for this research and really this kind of academic environment to thrive within the firm, and that influences our projects and the way we do analysis on those projects as well.
That's awesome. Well, I prepped you for the last thing. If you could leave anyone with a final thought or inspiration, what would that be?
So I think my final thought is, you know, we're all landscape architects because we're doing what we love. Now it's our job to proselytize landscape architecture and not just kind of navel gaze and be head down in our projects, but really get out into the world and tell everyone what we do as landscape architects. And for me, that means working upstream as a planner and influencing policy. It means getting in front of government officials. It means, you know, running for local office, serving on your local planning board or planning commission, you know, conservation commission, what have you. Be a part of government, have a voice, let others know what it is that we bring to the table.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Michael. And thanks you everybody for for tuning in. If you're interested in more conversations and topics like this, keep in touch. And next month we have Kellyanne Foster hosting with us on February 10th. And she is a professor and registered landscape architect whose work is rooted in outreach that is interdisciplinary and forward-thinking. She's the director of the online geodesign graduate program at Penn State and a professor in the landscape architecture department. She has 35 years of professional practice experience and has been teaching landscape architecture at Penn State for 30 plus years. So we look forward to seeing you all in the future. And Michael, I hope this is just the start of a relationship that the Northern California chapter can continue with you on into the future to help you achieve some of your goals within agriculture and change in design.
You're the perfect place for it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
I enjoyed this.
Thank you.